there is a thought you cannot stop having. You know the one. It arrives uninvited, occupies the whole room, and you are inside it before you even realize it entered. You are no longer thinking the thought. You have become it. And here is what makes this strange. You are aware right now that this happens to you, which means some part of you is not the thought. Some part of you watches the thought arrive, take over, and eventually leave. But most of the time, that watching part is asleep at its post. The question that Vedantic philosophers, Buddhist meditators, and modern scientists all arrived at, through entirely different routes, is this. What actually happens to a thought when you watch it? Somewhere in India, roughly 3,000 years ago, contemplatives working in the Vedantic tradition made an observation that their entire philosophical system eventually came to rest upon. They noticed something curious about the mind. You can think a thought, but you can also know that you are thinking a thought. These are not the same activity. One is caught inside experience. The other stands slightly apart from it. They called this capacity the sakshi, the witness. Not a mystical concept, a precise psychological observation. There is the content of the mind, the thoughts, the emotions, the memories, the fears. And then there is the awareness in which all of that content appears. The sakshi is not a thought. It cannot be a thought, because it is the thing that watches thoughts. This distinction sounds simple. It is not. Most human beings spend most of their lives entirely identified with the content of their minds. The thought arises, and they are the thought. The emotion arrives, and they are the emotion. The Vedantic philosophers called this the fundamental confusion, mistaking the screen for the film being projected on it. The sakshi doesn't try to stop thoughts. It doesn't judge them. It simply witnesses. And in that witnessing, something shifts. Buddhist meditation practice, developed independently and thousands of miles away, arrived at the same territory through a different door. The Pali word is sati, usually translated as mindfulness, though the original meaning is closer to clear knowing. The Buddha's instructions were precise. You do not try to empty the mind. You do not try to stop thinking. You observe the arising and passing of mental events. You note thinking, feeling, wanting, fearing. You do not follow the content. You simply observe that it is occurring. What Buddhist practitioners reported across 15 centuries of systematic investigation was consistent. Thoughts observed clearly begin to lose their grip. Not because you have suppressed them, not because you have argued yourself out of them, but because observation itself changes the relationship between you and the content of your mind. You have become the watcher. The thought is now the watched. In 1927, Werner Heisenberg published what became known as the uncertainty principle. At the quantum level, the act of measuring a particle changes the particle. Observation and observed are not separate systems. Heisenberg was describing subatomic physics, not psychology. The parallel should not be stretched further than it carries, but it is striking enough to have occupied thinkers in both fields ever since. When you observe a thought, genuinely observe it rather than being carried by it, something measurable changes. the thought loses intensity. The emotional charge drops. The sense of urgency fades. Modern research consistently shows that the simple act of labeling a mental state reduces its neurological intensity. The observer and the observed are not, it turns out, as separate as they appeared. 3 traditions, 3,000 years of independent investigation. The same discovery in each. When you step back far enough to watch your own mind, you have introduced a gap between yourself and the content. That gap is where freedom lives. The Vedantins called it sakshi. The Buddhists called it sati. Modern neuroscience calls it metacognition. Different words for the same capacity. The mind turned toward itself, watching its own operations with something approaching clarity. Here is why this doesn't happen naturally. Thoughts are loud. They are compelling. They arrive with the full emotional weight of whatever triggered them, and they present themselves not as mental events, but as reality. This thought is not just a thought. It is a fact about the world, a verdict about you, a certainty about what will happen next. The nervous system reinforces this. Thoughts connected to threat activate the same circuitry as actual threat. The body responds. The mind narrows. And in that narrowed state, the watching capacity, the sakshi, the metacognitive awareness, simply goes offline. You are inside the experience. The observer has collapsed into the observed. This is not a character flaw. It is how the system is built. The question is whether you can train the observer to stay present even when the content is loud. Start small. Deliberately small. At some point today, you will notice you are thinking. Not during a crisis, those come later. Find a quiet moment. Sit for 5 minutes and simply watch what arises. Do not try to stop thoughts. Do not evaluate them. When a thought appears, note it plainly. Thinking. That is the entire instruction. Not what you are thinking about, just the bare recognition that thinking is occurring. What you are doing is activating the sakshi. You are practicing the distinction between the content of the mind and the awareness that watches the content. Most people have only ever been the content. When a thought carries strong emotion, and some will, note that too. Feeling, one word, then return to watching. The Buddhists recommended this practice for the same reason the Vedantins did, and for the same reason cognitive therapists now prescribe a version of it. Distance from mental content is not detachment from life. It is clarity about what is actually happening, which is the only reliable basis for choosing how to respond. This is one thread in a much larger practice. Ancient traditions built complete systems around the observer, methods that work with mind, body, and spirit together, progressively, over years. Not as self-improvement, as genuine transformation in how consciousness itself operates. If that calls to something in you, visit maaoot.org. The next time a thought arrives with the full force of certainty, the next time it insists it is not a thought, but simply the truth, see if you can find the one who is watching it.